I'm here to talk about today is a consequence of a piece of research work that I did for the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees just about a year ago now. They were pursuing a court case on the exclusions under the Public Service Employee Relations Act of 1977, and they wanted to do a charter challenge. The problem, because the charter wasn't written when Bill 41, the Public Service Employee Relations Act, was composed, you could make a charter challenge subsequently because the charter was passed after. And the only defense against a charter challenge in those cases is if the government could prove that there was sufficient consultation and acquiescence between the two parties. So while I was doing this work, I went off to the archives and disappeared for about 6 weeks and found just a literal gold mine of things. And at the end of the day, I finished work for AUP and I asked them, look, I said, this is such interesting stuff. I would like to write an academic article and submit it to Labour Le Travail. And they had no problem with that. So that's what this is that I've been continued beavering away at it. And basically this is a couple of I think really important sub-themes on this whole business, the business of Bill 41 and the Public Service Employee Relations Act and the ALHI government and the CSA of A as they were at the beginning of the process, who were AUPE, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, at the end of the process. Okay, I call it delaying, disarming, and deceiving the union. The ALHI government, AUP, and Bill 41, the Public Service Employee Relations Act 1977. Very catchy title, right? But I thought this pretty much sums up the fundamental process that's going on here. I don't know if any of you have ever examined three-card Monte. Three-card Monte is a card trick played on the streets of London and New York, and it's a con game. And it usually takes a couple of players. There's the guy with the cards, and there's a confederate in the crowd. And they wait for a sucker to come by. And then they say, in this case it's the ace. It's sometimes just done with the queen and two other cards. And he says, I'm going to mix these up. And if you can pick out the ace in this case, whatever money you put down, we'll double it. So it's like you bet 5, you get 5. And the way the scam works is that the guy walks up and he bends the corner of the ace. And then he goes back to the mark and he says, I bent the corner of the ace, right? And the guy looks, and sure enough, the ace has a bent corner. So if it takes a little more, they bet the guy who bent the corner bets a little bit and wins a bit. And then this guy dives in and bets, like $100, right? And picks out the bent corner, but it's not the ace. That's three-card Monte in a nutshell. And as the point where they scoop up his money, they usually have a guy at the corner say, the cops are coming. And everybody grabs everything and runs away and leaves the poor guy $100 short. So that's three-card Monte. And basically speaking, the gentleman with the hat is the Peter ALHI government, and you're in the position of Bill Broad, from the president of the Civil Servants Association of Alberta, at about the time that this whole process starts. Okay, so just to give you just a little bit of background on it, the CSA of A has existed since 1919. They were started at the end, in that big upsurge of labor radicalism at the tail end of the First World War. And they were formed to protect and advance the rights of employees of the province of Alberta. In other words, the direct employees of the Crown. And they needed protection because up until then, one of the first acts passed in the province, the Public Service Act, made it, if you asked for a wage increase, or if you got somebody to ask for a wage increase for you as a public employee, that was considered to be turning in your resignation. It's right in the law. It's in the statute of 1906, the Public Service Act. You could, if even getting a friend or your supervisor to say, I think Bob deserves a raise, they said, okay, Bob, that's it, you're out the door. The employer reserved sole right under the Act to describe what work you do, when you do it, how you do it, and overtime pay was prohibited under the terms of the Act. So they had a Labor Act for the rest of the province, and they had the Public Service Act for their own employees. It's a pretty sweet deal when you get to make up the ground rules for your own workers and say, yes, you can enjoy all the rights that are contained in the Act, and we'll tell you what they are. And by the way, if you have any rights that we think are getting in the way of us doing what we want to do, we'll make sure they're not there. Anyway, so to make a long story short, in 1919, the CSA of A is formed voluntarily as a non-profit society. And immediately the government started trying to suborn it. And they basically boxed it into becoming a consulting organization only. They refused to negotiate with the union at all. They would take advice from them, but they wouldn't negotiate. And they would not sign a collective agreement. So this went on until the Social Credit Party were elected, and by 1938, the Social Credit Party were so happy with the CSA of A and its council and its joint consultations that they actually enshrined it in an act that made the CSA of A an official body of the legislature, and it was a big, wonderful love-in. The top level of the public service, the deputy ministers, were in the CSA of A and were oftentimes the executive. So the workers at the bottom end got nothing. In the 1960s, as the rest of the public sector across the country unionized, and you could see it with the postal workers in '65, the Public Service Alliance of Canada in 1966, I believe, the formation of CUPE in the early '60s, which gathered in a bunch of disparate municipal workers, but also created a huge organizing drive within the hospitals and school systems. So everywhere across Canada, public sector workers are organizing and successfully, increasing their wages and benefits, and most important of all, I think, protecting their members on the job from arbitrary and sort of punitive treatments, basically suffering the injustices that complete employer authority gives them. The CSA of A members began a very long campaign attempting to transform themselves into a union. And they thought they had it made in 1971, when the then leader of the opposition, a young Calgary lawyer for the oil companies called Peter ALHI, sent them a letter saying, if I'm elected, I will give you the same bargaining rights, the same rights as every other union has in this province. And although I couldn't swear to it, I am pretty sure that given that letter, I think the CSA of A and its members and its executive probably pushed really hard to vote for the Conservative Party at that point. They thought it was their ticket. So 1971, Peter ALHI gets elected, and Bill Broad sends him a letter and said, "Okay, you promised you give us those rights. Please let us become. We want to become a real union, and we want to be under the Alberta Labour Act." And he said, "That's not what I meant." He said, "I said you'd enjoy the same rights. I didn't say you'd be under the same act. And I never said anything about the right to strike," which, of course, was the fundamental issue. If you don't have the right to strike, you don't have much of anything as a trade union. So things start to get more and more heated. 1974 becomes a really pivotal year. In 1974, there were 4 separate strikes which were unheard of by the CSA of A. The trades and allies workers went on strike. The Liquor Control Board workers went on strike, something that they were to prove famous for in subsequent years. And I believe, I'm not sure, but the last and most important one in October of '74, 12,500 what they call departmental service workers walked off the job. So that's that in anybody's terms, when 12,500 people walk off on a wildcat strike, and that's what it is, it gets the government's attention. And this was complicated by the fact that the ALHI government was now walking into their election years. 1975 would be their election year, and late '74, they're faced with an escalating series of wildcat strikes by public service employees. And furthermore, as I think that if you look at labor history, what you'll find is it's almost an ironclad rule that when workers go on strike, when they're standing up for themselves on the street, they enjoy the most popular support at any time that people have sympathy when you're putting your job and your existence on the line and standing up for the people around you. It engenders public support. I would offer the picture of the Gainers strike, where every other union on the province came out to that picket line, but hundreds of non-union people went there. They said, these people, I understand that these people's cause is just, and I'm prepared to stand up for them. And just in exactly the same way, public employees were so badly paid, the provincial employees were so badly paid and so badly treated at work, that the public was on their side while they were on strike. There was no great, I mean, the media will always find somebody who thinks that it's a travesty of justice. But in the main, the overall popularity of the strikers convinced the Lougheed government that they needed to silence this discontent during their electoral run in 1975. They're coming up for an election in the spring of 75, and the last thing they want is a massive public sector strike of their own employees while the election is going on. Now, the CSA of A, under Bill Broad, had been demanding a royal commission into public sector workers' rights. And I don't know about you, but I've got a really big problem with the union asking for a royal commission. And I'll tell you why I have the problem. I've seen a lot of royal commissions in Canada, and a royal commission was always seemed to me to be the way government delayed an issue so that they didn't have to deal with an unfortunate issue, right? In 1886, when there was massive labor unrest across Ontario and Quebec, they had the Royal Commission on Capital and Labor. It came out with, I don't know, there was just like a ton of recommendations, right? But by the time the commission reported back, all that labor unrest has died down, and what the workers got out of all of these recommendations for labor peace was one thing: Labor Day. That was it. So out of all the rights and all of their issues and all the problems they had, they got one day in September where the government could say, geez, you worked hard all year, attaboy. That kind of reminds me of National Secretary's Day, right? You know, he said, I've treated you badly all year, but here, have some flowers. Oh, okay, yum, yum, it's all good. Anyway, sorry, my own cynicism coming out. Anyway, so I thought it was a little odd that CSA of A would ask for a royal commission, because I thought, you're just playing into their hands. But the government ignored the AUP's request repeatedly. They wouldn't even meet with them. They wouldn't reply to their letters. They wouldn't meet with them in person. This is during this strike period. Then when the last big strike hits, all of a sudden the government gets a hold of Bill Broad and said, we'd like to talk. We'd like to talk, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to set up not a royal commission, but a royal commission's sort of younger and stupider brother. And it's called a task force. And the reason that it's younger and stupider, if you want, is because on a royal commission you appoint some independent person who's got some kind of authority in the area to do a public investigation and get public input and come up with recommendations that the government might or might not like, right? In this case, the task force was made up of 2 members of the upper echelons of the personnel department of the government of Alberta and 2 people from the CSA of A. So now you've got 2 and 2. So what is going to happen, do you suppose, when the labor side wants the right to strike and the government doesn't want to give them the right to strike? Any suggestions? Impasse, right? And what happens with an impasse? Well, we'll see. It gets interesting. Anyway, so the CSA of A, after some waffling around, said, okay, we'll take this task force. And they took the task force. Now here's where, if I only included the PowerPoint that I emailed to him a letter saying, please find attached my PowerPoint and we'll set it up here. I have copies of these great memos I found in the archives that are from the government of Alberta's own internal documents, where they say, fundamentally, it's just a flat-out scam. They said, we have to keep labor peace for as long as possible. So they did things like they didn't send out the letter naming their people to the task force for 3 weeks. Then they took another 3 weeks to do something else, and then they took another. So by the time the task force is actually set up, it's already, I believe, March, and the day that they announced the task force in the legislature, they dropped the writ for the 1975 election. So here's the union now participating in a fact-finding tour that takes them another year and a half while the election goes on, and the Conservatives win a massive majority with no labor unrest whatsoever occurring during the process. Still, CSA of A did get one thing during the beginning of the process, and that is the government changed the law to allow them to become an independent union, and they transformed themselves into the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. So now they're independent of the government, but the first thing is they then provide them with the draft. After all this work, they provide them with the draft of the Public Service Employee Relations Act. And the first thing it does is absolutely and completely strip the right to strike from all Crown employees. And they said, this isn't the process we're in on. And the government said, listen, what we've done is we have taken your task force, and every recommendation that the two government people made on the task force, we adopted. And every recommendation that the two sides could agree on, we adopted, and that's it. So everything that the union wanted, that the management didn't agree to, didn't get adopted, and didn't get put into law. Including, in some cases, they went even beyond what those two management people recommended. The two management people recommended that the governing board of PSERA be 3 people. One from the named by the Alberta Federation of Labour, one to be named by the government, and the 2 of them to pick between them an impartial chair, right? So that actually gives you some idea. You might get a board that might actually give you a fair decision. Instead, the government, when you look at the act itself, it's a 5-person board, all of them appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. So that they chose who would be the Labour representatives, they chose who would be management representatives, and they chose the chair. I guess without my fancy memos, it's not quite so much fun. But I will say that what I found in this background memos are absolute, unmitigated proof that they had no intention of doing anything with the task force. What I found is a complete compendium of what the government was going to put into PSERA was already contained in an internal document from a meeting with all of the top ministers and the provincial treasurer before the task force started out on its trips around Canada. So they already had the act basically fleshed out before that task force went out. Furthermore, they had hired an academic specialist out of McGill University to advise the government side on how best to, what best to do with this act, and they hid that information from their Labour task force members. So the whole point of the task force was supposed to be this cooperative effort to go out and find information and find the best solution. And instead, what you've got is a government who's already made up their minds, already has it written, and is flim-flamming the union, buying Labour peace all the way through to the election and then the introduction of the Public Service Employee Relations Act. So, lessons to be learned, because that's always the important part of this. First off, and I did a lot of thinking about it, and it's I don't want to overgeneralize, but what I'd say is that when you look at that task force and that whole tactic by the government, and you look at all of the different ways that the government has intervened in labor relations in Canadian history, it has always been to delay conflict. Starting from Mackenzie King's Industrial Disputes Investigation Act, they have, where you couldn't go on strike, during the length of the conciliation, but at the end of the day, the conciliation wasn't mandatory. All of this, all of these delays play into the hands of employers. It's because when people are angry and excited and standing up for themselves, when you get wildcat strikes, like the strikes in 1974, the membership feed on each other, right? What happens is you get more and more, you get momentum, and more people become involved, and more people in the public are aware of your issues. As soon as you pull the plug on that, as soon as you stop, delay, or sort of put the handbrake on, then you lose that momentum, and it's really hard to get it back. If let's put it this way. The Gaynors strike, which is sort of a seminal strike, when the UFCW decided they would obey the injunction and not try to block those buses, and I believe that was the end of June, right? And it was when they declared the Disputes Inquiry Board and appointed Mr. Dubinsky to run this Disputes Inquiry Board. They decided to give them labor peace during the DIB. Well, all that did was, I think, dismay the strikers, dilute all of the public support for them, and play completely into the hands of Pocklington. So what I would say is that, the lesson to be learned is, if you're going to be a principled labor leader, you never go back without the contract in your hand. In other words, if your members are willing to fight for something, you cannot stop fighting. You can't say, well, wait for a minute, boys, and we'll come back to this in 6 months. Because in 6 months, they're not going to be with you anymore. And the idea of, it seems to me that genuine principled leadership of a labor movement is always, always, always to support your members. When they're ready to fight, you better be ready to fight. And one of my heroes in the labor movement is a guy called Jean-Claude Perrault, was the national president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Jean-Claude Perrault was told by Pierre Trudeau that he had to get on national television and order the postal workers back to work. And he said he wouldn't do it. He refused. And they put him in jail.
Yeah, that's right.
They put him in jail, and you stop and think about this. We think we live in a democracy. We think that we have freedom of speech and freedom of thought. The Trudeau government basically said, you will say what we want you to say, regardless of the fact that you don't believe it and don't want to say it, or we'll put you in jail. And when he refused, they put him in jail. So you think you have those rights, but you best check your back pocket really closely to make sure you have them. So that's lesson one: is if they send you back, don't go back. If you're in the middle of a struggle, the only time you go back is if you get what you're out for, right? The second thing is, never trust a conservative. And the third thing is, if you see this guy in the street, run. Okay, thanks very much. Yes. Oh, wait. I think we do this presentations first, questions after.
Okay.
The first time I met James Muir is when he showed up at a meeting of ALHI. I guess maybe Alvin had spoken to you or somebody. And we now have a number of academics along with the other volunteers. But I want to introduce James Muir, a young man coming here to talk about labor problems. He's an assistant professor of history at the University of Alberta. Studies labor history. Grew up in Winnipeg. It's usually a pretty good sign in the labor movement. Grew up in Winnipeg, went to university there, and in Toronto, and in New Zealand. In Toronto, he was a member of CUPE and was involved in a strike that succeeded in 1999 and the year 2000. James Muir.
The corollary to the strike I was involved in '99 is that since I've moved to Edmonton, I've become a member of the Academic Staff Association at the University of Alberta, and we successfully, I say that ironically, voted to give up our collective bargaining rights last week for 2 years because the boss thought it would be best if we did. I didn't vote for that. But, and so ALHI and this conference is a nice relief from that. Today, what I want to talk about is, in a really impersonal way, the way I'm trying to understand the sorts of work ALHI does and the sorts of things it can do going forward, and the sorts of things other people in this room, other trade unionists, other working people can do in telling their stories and what the power of those stories can be. And I think as a start, we can just think of what we've been listening to over the last day and a half. The stories we've heard have been wonderful. I've sat in these rooms and I've cried and I've laughed. And that's something exceptional. I think it's something that many of us have probably experienced in the last day and a half. The question, though, is what happens next? Most people in our unions, in our communities, aren't listening to these stories today. And so the question is, what can we do with these stories to push them forward? And because I'm an academic, I have an academic answer that I hope will be exciting anyways. My answer starts with this book and this man. Eric Olin Wright is a sociologist. He teaches at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He was a founder of or one of the founders of a group of Marxists in the 1970s called themselves the analytical Marxists or the no bullshit Marxists. And he spent most of his career studying classes, studying how to understand class in the modern world. In the last 15 years, he's been working more and more on a project that he entitles Envisioning Real Utopias, or the Real Utopias Project. And in his most recent book, he outlines something that he calls Emancipatory Social Science. And I think it's something that we do, and I think it's something that we can capitalize on. He starts with two things: a claim. So many forms of human suffering and many deficits in human flourishing are the result of existing institutions and social structures. And this is something that we can probably all accept. That we might not say that all suffering comes from this. Certainly, when you stub your toe, it might be an existing structure you stubbed your toe on, but that's not really what he's talking about. He's talking about capitalism. He's saying that capitalism is causing suffering, and capitalism is preventing us from achieving happiness. His next step, though, is more argumentative. Something probably most people in the room will accept, but not most people in this institution. And that is that transforming those institutions and structures, transforming capitalism, has the potential to substantially reduce human suffering and expand possibilities for human flourishing. The first claim, even Stephen Harper might accept. He might accept that people lose their jobs in a capitalist environment. They're going to suffer a bit for a while until they get a better job at McDonald's or something. But he's unlikely to accept the thesis that the way you make people better is to change capitalism, to try to get rid of capitalism as much as you can. But it's that thesis that Wright proposes, and it's a thesis I agree with, and it's a thesis that I think ALHI and other sorts of people's history can live up to. His definition of emancipatory social science is this: it seeks to generate scientific knowledge relevant to the collective project of challenging various forms of human oppression. In other words, it's a way of creating real, verifiable knowledge, real, verifiable stories that point the way toward positive change. And he has 3 steps to do it. He has step 1, which is saying that we want to diagnose the problems and critique the world that creates these problems. So essentially answer the question, why doesn't the world live up to our ideals? His second step is to pose alternatives. What would get us closer to our ideals? What do we desire? But it's not just what we desire. There's lots of things that we can desire that we can't actually achieve, or that we might not want to, in the end, achieve. So there's desirability. There's viability. What can we desire? What that we desire is likely to work. And there's achievable. What can we desire that's likely to work that we can make happen now? And the next step is a theory, a way of understanding how to get those changes, how to make those alternatives. And he has three ideas for how we can make alternatives. So what's something he calls ruptural or revolution. We can smash the state. Something that he calls interstitial. And this he bases on the ideas of the Wobblies and other syndicalist anarchists. Essentially, ignore the state. Do things away. And there's the social democratic, the symbiotic response. Try to reform the state. And he would argue that all three are important at various stages. Now, I read this book, and I really liked the message that he was arguing through all of this. And it's not simply that he's got this nice theory that appeals to people who work in universities. He's got real examples of how this works, and he sets out several in his book. He gives you an example like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an encyclopedia that's done entirely by volunteers, by people across the world, and in the process, it has completely supplanted a whole section of capitalist production. Encyclopedia Britannica, a company that's been around for 200 years, has declared it will no longer print encyclopedias because everybody uses Wikipedia instead. Now, there might be problems with what we find in Wikipedia and so on, but the idea of thousands and thousands of people around the world coming together and building knowledge together and supplanting a capitalist control of knowledge is a wonderful thing. He has other examples. Talks about things like public libraries as being little bits of real utopia. And I think, in a way, the collective agreement is a bit of a real utopia. It's not a whole lot of utopia, but it's a lot more utopia than workers without collective agreements have. And so I think thinking about that, thinking about the things that the union movement has already achieved as moving us towards utopia is something that we can do to sort of help understand what we're doing. But the problem with Wright, well, there are lots of problems with Wright, but one of the big problems with Wright is that he's a sociologist who doesn't just not talk about history, but in fact entirely ignores history. He's not particularly interested in people doing historical work. He's thinking forward and thinking about the present, and his model doesn't really address anybody doing historical work. But more importantly, it doesn't really address the sort of historical work that you and I are involved in doing. But this man, Ralph Samuel, a Marxist historian from Britain, a communist historian from Britain first, and then in 1956, with the secret speeches and the invasion of Hungary, no longer a communist, but a Marxist historian, wrote in this book, in People's History of Social Theory, he wrote an essay on people's history, which I think underlines what groups like ALHI do, what the people in this conference have been doing, telling their stories, and that we can meld together with emancipatory social science. He says, people's history could describe a whole series of cultural initiatives that are found mainly, but not exclusively, outside the institutions of higher education or only on their extramural fringes. And that describes ALHI in particular. ALHI is a group of mainly current and retired working people, trade unionists and others, with a handful of university people who are part of it, myself included, but who all the university people do it as sort of volunteer work, extracurricular work away from the job. It's something that is outside of professional history, outside of professional academic speak, and all the better for it. It says that people's history always represents some attempt to broaden the basis of history, to enlarge its subject matter and to make new raw materials and offer new maps of knowledge. One of the speakers yesterday talked about this in a very clear way. What we've been doing in this conference is trying to tell a new story of Alberta. The stories that people have told around the rooms here is not a story of Alberta as mavericks running forward to make a better business climate for us all. Alberta is a story of working people facing oppression and working hard to overcome that oppression and get better lives. People's history is about telling new stories that are our stories, the stories that we don't otherwise hear. People's history today is characteristically used to denote a history that's local in scale, he says. And that's true. Most of what the stuff we've been doing is very local. The story circles are people telling their own stories. And even as we expand it out and we make it all of Alberta, the stories we tell are Albertan stories. They're not the stories of Canada, let alone the stories of the world. But Samuel reminds us that people's history has been those things in the past. We think of something like Engels' history of the family, the state, and property. This is a history, a people's history, that covered the entire history of the world. So there's something to be said for telling our local stories, but there's something to remember about the fact that our local stories, even if they are about us and about our small little space in the world, they are about the whole world. It's also said that it's mainly about subjective experience. It's about reconstituting the small details of everyday life and a preoccupation with more spontaneous forms of resistance. And the stories we've been telling have been doing that. The last panel on the dandelions is a great example of this. The dandelions event or group was essentially an entirely spontaneous mode of resistance. A spontaneous resistance when the other ways to resist didn't exist. The stories Jim just told us about the wildcat strikes in the 70s were the same. These were resistance with strikes that occurred because the legal forms didn't exist. And it's also both realist and romantic. And I think we can see that in the stories we've been telling too. Right? The fact that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, right, that we can laugh and cry at the stories being told suggests their romantic nature, their appeal. But they're real stories. Their romance is there in the possibilities that the stories open up. But the story's strength lies in the fact that it's real people who did these things. And finally, it's political. People's history is always political history. And so I combine these two things and I say, well, what does that mean for a project like ALHI? And I think it starts where the conference started, with Brother Dave standing up and reminding us that there are two classes: those who own and those who make their living helping the owners own more. Helping might be the wrong verb. Keeping that politics in mind, our stories, the politics of our stories are stories about how to resist that class structure. When Sister Jenny yesterday said, we have to remember the ways in which the trade union movement worked in different ways, whether it was with class or with race, or with sex and gender. That's true, and we have to keep that in mind in our politics as well. But in all of those things, our stories are stories about being oppressed and overcoming the oppression, and giving a model to how to overcome the oppression, to assert that we can make something better. So telling our stories give examples of individual emancipation. The story yesterday in the Occupational Health and Safety Circle about, and there was again in the film, about the shutdown of the mill in Hinton is a great example of that. It's an example of a small group of workers at first who come to realize the danger of their workplace and educate each other and eventually work together to, at least to some degree, rescue themselves from that danger. It's a great story about a group of workers who were able to get rid of asbestos. But that's not all it is. We have to take our stories and make them, send them out, and make them emancipatory for the rest of our society, or at least the rest in our class. Our stories are always about alternatives. Sometimes the alternatives we have are desirable, and sometimes, as in Jim's stories, the alternatives we're given are not. Sometimes what we can talk about fighting for were viable, and sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were achievable, and sometimes they weren't. But telling all those stories, whether they're stories of success or failure, is a way of mapping out for those around us what sorts of things we can dream about, what sorts of things we can think about, what sorts of things we can fight for and achieve. Our stories are stories of transformation. They're stories of violence against us, and sometimes violence by us. They're stories of us going our own way, of rejecting the boss, of rejecting union leadership, of rejecting the workplace entirely at times. And they're stories of reform, of making minor changes over time. The movie last night about family benefits is a good example of that. Several small changes over time, expanding into something that is really important for workers in both the public and the private sector, workers who are organized and unorganized. What we don't do much of is this diagnosis and critique. We don't contextualize our stories much in trying to explain how my story or your story is everyone's story, and how your story can help younger workers, workers the same age or older in different workplaces, how your story reflects on, helps explain the problem that they face. Corruption and asbestos abatement in Hinton is the same story as corruption and controlling coal dust at Westray. Happened almost the exact same time. And both stories of corruption in occupational health and safety protection are stories that we can see replicated again and again through to the present. And we have to tell our stories in a way that makes that clear. We need to be explicit about how what we have achieved works to make a better world for us, for our families, and for others. There's a great slogan, a bumper sticker slogan. The weekend, brought to you by unions, or thanks to the unions who brought us the weekend. This idea that unions brought us 5-day work weeks and 40-hour wages, or 5-day and 40-hour work weeks, is a core element of the stories that we as unionists tell. But it's something we have to do more of. We have to start in a very public way, in the way like the AUP billboards do, showing you the woman cleaning the window and saying, this is the person standing between you and germs. Right? We have to tell those stories in a way beyond our confines to try to take our message of emancipation, our message of possibility beyond. And we have to show to those in our movement and to those who want to join the movement what works and what doesn't work in the past. As Ezekiel said at the end of the Dandelion session, we don't need to have new workers, young workers, workers in new situations feel they have to reinvent the wheel every time. We need to show them that the wheel of transformation exists, and this is what it was. This is what it is. And we have to do that in a way that engages our audience. I think we do this part really well. And we've just got to keep doing it, and we've got to make it more political when we do it. Thank you.